A very warm welcome to our global audience connected with us for this webinar on engaging the private sector in fast start NAMAs. I'm Alexandra Sötzer with UNDP MDG Carbon. This webinar is the fourth in the series POA and Beyond, which comprises in total 5 webinars until June 2014 and is organized jointly by UNDP through its MDG Carbon Programme and the World Bank Group Climate Change Team in collaboration with the World Bank Institute, E-Institute. The webinar series POA and Beyond aims to contribute to addressing the challenges of POAs, MRV and new instruments such as NAMAs through sharing and discussing existing knowledge, good practices and new trends. Talking about NAMAs, it's evident that the NAMAs concept is still evolving and there is, as of today, relatively little on-the-ground experience with turning the concept into concrete actions. NAMAs are well suited as holistic programs, but their success will be strongly influenced by the level of engagement of private sector actors. This webinar will provide a brief overview on the topic of NAMAs and present a proposed structure for the design of NAMAs involving the creation of investment opportunities for the private sector and delivery of a range of benefits for the implementing country. This will be accompanied by an example of how such a NAMA investment design could work in practice. The points to be discussed in this webinar will include matters such as national approvals, sources of funding, the definition of MRV standards, and considerations that would be essential to retain private sector interest. After the presentation, participants will be invited to engage in a critical analysis of the concept with a view of strengthening its design. In today's webinar, we are pleased to have with us Mr. Gareth Phillips, founding partner at Climate and Sustainability Partners and chairman of the Project Developer Forum. So without any further ado, it's over to our presenter, Gareth.
Alexandra, thank you very much for that introduction, and also thank you to UNDP for the invitation to develop and present this seminar, and thanks to everybody for taking the time to dial in and join. It's very instructive to be asked to think about these things and to put your thoughts down on paper, because it really causes you or requires you to try to think through these processes in some detail. And Alexandra and I had a couple of to and fro's on this, and I had input from some of my colleagues in the Project Developer Forum, and I'd like to acknowledge that input and say that it's been a very interesting process, and I hope you also find the presentation interesting. I'm going to start off with just to give you a quick overview of what we're going to cover. I'm going to talk a bit about NAMAs and the CDM, because I think there is still some lack of understanding about the similarities and the differences between these two. So I want to say a little bit about that, and then I'm going to draw on an example of a pre-compliance target and a description of a specific example for today's presentation, which I hope will help to put the whole concept into context a little bit. And then I'm going to go into some detail as to how we might see this actual fast start NAMA operating, or look at the roles of some of the different participants. So we've got the implementing country, a buying nation or donor supporters role, the roles for project developers and financiers. And then I want to look at some of the specific characteristics as to how we might see such a NAMA functioning. So we're going to look at payment for results. I'm going to talk a little bit about a bidding process and as to how the private sector would get involved through that. And then we've got some specific design considerations that help and again emphasize some of the differences between NAMAs and the CDM. So moving on to start off then with some comments about comparing NAMAs and the CDM. Clearly they have a lot in common, and both NAMAs and the Clean Development Mechanism are instruments that have been designed to help the parties help the world in general come to terms and deal with climate change. But there are some very important differences, and these are by no means all of the differences, but these are the ones that have presented themselves to me as being some of the most relevant, and particularly relevant for this discussion. First of all, with NAMAs we have implementing countries, whereas with the CDM we have host countries. Now, this is already quite significant because of the connotations that go with that language. In the CDM, we know what host country means, and we know that for the CDM we have to have a host country letter of approval. And that, of course, is a very specific instrument that allows for the transfer of units out of the host country and into another registry. Whereas under NAMAs, we have only a requirement for ministerial support, and there is no structure designed to facilitate any kind of transfer of units associated with carbon accounting out of NAMAs. Which then leads us to kind of emphasize the point that NAMAs are about mitigation, or as the name suggests, it's a nationally appropriate mitigation action, whereas the CDM was designed to create emission reductions. Now, emission reductions can be transferred, can be cancelled as a part or a contribution to host country mitigation. And I know in the PD forum we've had a lot of discussion about this, and we think it's a very positive route forward for the CDM. But the CDM was originally designed to facilitate the transfer of units out of the country. And if you transfer units out of the country, then they can't be used to contribute towards host country mitigation. And I mean, this is a very interesting point, and if non-Annex 1 countries were required to account for greenhouse gas emissions, or if there is a time when they do and they do some kind of inventory, then in theory they would need to work off the baseline emissions from project activities, not the with project emissions, and that would be one way to avoid the double counting. So it's a very clear distinction that we start to see coming up between NAMAs and the CDM. And the final point here is that the MRV processes under NAMAs are yet to be defined, or are really quite flexible, whereas we know within the CDM project cycle we have very specific rules around the monitoring and reporting, and I think these have been one of the really strong successes of the CDM, and they may be areas that we would want to look at replicating or borrowing from when we come to develop and implement NAMAs. So really, in conclusion, NAMAs, I see NAMAs really as a different way of tackling the climate change issue. They are not a lifeline for the CDM, and you know that they're working in the same space, but they're doing so in a very different way. And so I don't think that we should get the two confused, and I don't think that we should think about NAMAs as an instrument that can help us solve the problems with the CDM. We need to deal with that under a different agenda item, effectively. So if we move on now to give the basis of an example or an existing situation that we might use as the basis for going forward, I'd like you to cast your mind back to 2008 when we were in the days of JI, and obviously things were looking quite different. But in 2008, within the EU, we were dealing with a number of accession states that were wanting to join the EU, including, I think, Romania and Czech Republic and a number of others. And as a requirement to join the EU, they were required to put in place plans and measures to come into line with various forms of EU legislation. And one such standard was the EU's landfill directive, which requires, amongst other things, that methane would be captured and treated. And the requirement was that if they acceded to the EU in 2008, they needed to fall into line with the European directives by 2012, the end of 2012. So what happened was that several entrepreneurial landfill operators successfully developed landfill gas JI projects. And they were considered to be additional because they were implemented ahead of a regulatory requirement. And they were successfully able to generate emission reduction units from as soon as they had their equipment operating until the 1st of January 2013. And I don't know, there may even be some people on this call who were involved in helping to set up some of these initiatives, because I know some of us are still around. So they were able to generate emission reduction units until the 31st of December 2012. And as of the 1st of January 2013, when compliance with the Landfill Gas Directive was required, the Landfill Directive was required, then those emission reductions started to contribute towards host country mitigation, or towards the mitigation in those accession states. Now, clearly there are some significant differences, but what I would propose is that if there was some sort of national recognition of these financing initiatives or activities, then their role in achieving national mitigation targets could lead them to be considered as some kind of early NAMA, or at least as an example of an early NAMA. And so with that in mind, we have a sort of the idea that we could use a similar approach to design and implement a range of NAMAs with the objective of financing the deployment of new technology or low-emission technology ahead of compliance deadlines or target dates. So I mean, I don't think there's anything particularly new in that. That's the concept of some sort of policy initiative or measure that's implemented by or put in place by an implementing country that then triggers further action. But if we turn that around and look at it a slightly different way, then I think there is the opportunity to use the NAMA concept to create transformational change via some of these kinds of innovative financing structures. And so for today's discussion and to kind of help maybe put some of these things into context, we could propose that in country X we aim to implement a renewable energy NAMA, with the implementing country setting a target of, for example, 10% renewable energy capacity by 2025, supported by domestically funded feed-in tariff and some sort of donor funding support for a NAMA. Now this is one example, but there are clearly plenty of other examples that we could choose, and we could see this being applied to the deployment of energy efficiency technology or sustainable forest management standards, construction of bus lanes, scrapping of cars, old cars, installation of installations. I think there's a very wide number of initiatives that we could apply this to. And those might be some examples that you'd like to think a little bit about when we come to some of the questions later on or at the end of the presentation. So with that example in mind, we could now look at the role of the implementing country. And I've identified two objectives for the implementing country. The first is to accelerate the deployment of technology to achieve this target, which we've said is 10% renewable energy capacity. And the idea is that delivers long-term mitigation benefits to the implementing country. So in our example, the deliverable, what we're looking for is megawatts of installed and commissioned renewable energy capacity. Now, obviously that deliverable changes depending on the kind of NAMA it is, but in our case it's megawatts of installed capacity that is the relevant metric. And the second objective for the implementing country is to create a mechanism which will enable the financing of the technology. And in this example, it's payment for commissioned renewable energy capacity before the 31st of December 2025. I don't know if I said, but that's when the target is, 2025. So that's the kind of deliverable and the payment structure that we're looking for. So the actions or the responsibilities for the implementing country include the fact that the government needs to create the policy environment in some sort of smart target, and I'm saying smart as in this specific, measurable, accurate, something and timed. And this might take the form of regulation or some sort of policy statement. I mean, I think sometimes policy statements can be very vague, so it would need to be a policy statement that this then is accompanied by regulations or implementing legislation. So it needs to be quite specific. They would need to demonstrate commitment towards meeting the target, and they would do that by, for example, helping to promote the NAMA, formally approving NAMA, and participation by private sector entities in the NAMA, and so on. They would need to then put in place the infrastructure to ensure that mitigation actions continue after the end of the target has passed and that the donor support ends, because of course up until the time that that target is reached, you're building the mitigation capacity, but after the target date has passed, then you need to carry on ensuring that that mitigation continues to be delivered. So the implementing country needs to build the capacity to ensure that that's going on. Now, in our example of a renewable energy situation, that's probably not particularly difficult, but if you looked at an energy efficiency now, for example, then it might be a little bit more difficult because you need to think about how do you ensure that that technology continues to be used. And then the other responsibility that I have for the implementing country is to work with the private sector and the donor to establish a NAMA coordinating entity, such as a unit within the responsible ministry. And I'm sure there's plenty of others, but these are some of the responsibilities for the implementing country. Now, if we move on to the donor, and I'm talking about donor in very generic terms here. It could be a sovereign fund, it could be the Green Planet Fund, it could be a multilateral development bank or another source. So we're just talking generically about donors. Now, the successful finance of the NAMA requires a sort of additional finance to overcome the barriers to business as usual. And the point is that this can be in addition to a feed-in tariff. There's no conflict in the fact that this would be in a situation where the feed-in tariff is not considered to be sufficient to overcome the barriers and they need some additional topping up. So obviously the size of the feed-in tariff could vary significantly. Now it's proposed that a buyer, such as a sovereign fund or one of these others, would be willing to pay for the delivery of, and I'm calling this an environmental or social good, an ESG. And we're proposing that they would be willing to pay for that for the following reasons. And in our example, the ESG is megawatts of installed renewable energy capacity. But obviously, the ESG could vary significantly. It could be it's any unit. We'll come to that in a minute. So the environmental and social goods, or ESG, are derived from a government-supported, government priority action to build long-term mitigation capacity. So that's really the first and foremost reason why a donor would want to help pay for the building of this capacity and take delivery of these ESGs. Hang on, lost control of the slides. Okay, so we go back to just the start of this slide, which is why we think that donors would want to finance this kind of activity. So it's proposed that a buyer, such as a sovereign fund, would be willing to pay for delivery of environmental or social goods, which is the term that I'm using, for a number of reasons. And those reasons include the fact that, first of all, these environmental and social goods are derived from a government-supported, this is implementing government-supported or government priority action to build long-term mitigation capacity. And really that's the essence of a NAMA. We want this transformational change. The units of environmental and social goods are agreed between the donor and the implementing country. So we need to have an intelligent donor coming in, and they need to understand what it is that they're paying for. But it's a negotiation between the donor and the implementing country to say, okay, this is what we want to pay for and this is what we're able to deliver. The ESG are delivered by an appropriate MRV issuance body, and here I'm going to propose that, for example, the Verified Carbon Standard would be an appropriate body to take over the responsibility of issuing these environmental and social goods. Or you could use a domestic scheme, but obviously we need the independence and so on there. And these ESG are submitted to the donor as evidence of the project's results, and they form the basis of the ability for payment by results. The donor support for the NAMA may be shorter than that of a conventional emission reduction project, which as we know is sort of 3 times 7 or 10 years, but also it should be long enough to leverage public sector finance at a rate of sort of 4 to 1, so that there needs to be enough time for the private sector to get enough money back so that they're prepared to put in 75% or more of the funding based on somewhere in the region of 25% commitment from public funds. The project owner is required to continue some kind of appropriate monitoring, reporting and verification after the mitigation, after the end or the achievement of the target, so that you have this long ongoing effect of mitigation benefit. And finally, the implementing ministry or government also receives a share of the revenues for the environmental and social goods to help them construct the supporting environment. So those are half a dozen reasons why I would propose that a donor of some sort would be willing to pay for or the delivery of environmental and social goods that come from the NAMA. So then, if we just look in a little bit more detail at this sort of MRV and issuance framework, because this is sort of very critical to the donor and the implementing government support. The choice of the MRV framework is up to the donor and the implementing government. Obviously, under the CDM, we had no choice. We had to go through that project cycle and have DOEs and all that kind of stuff and use approved methodologies. But in this case, the choice of instruments is up to the donor and the implementing government, but we would propose or suggest that they do borrow quite a lot of the experience that we've had with the CDM. And so, for example, we would like to see a robust methodology delivering accurate, complete, consistent and transparent reporting. We would like to see stakeholder consultation in that process and the use of accredited verifiers. Those are elements that we would propose would deliver credibility to this process. And as I said, many of these features of the MRV are related to the carbon market, but there is no need for a formal approval process because issues such as double counting, aren't relevant because we're not transferring units out of the country. And critically, the units in which the ESG are measured are fully negotiable. So in our case, they're megawatts of renewable energy capacity, but in other examples, they could be hectares of forest under sustainable forest management, they could be old cars scrapped or kilometres of bus lanes and so on. And the reason why those are acceptable units is because they are all correlated to a greater or lesser degree, but they're all correlated with mitigation action. And the assumption is that when a country starts to create or starts to undertake national accounting of greenhouse gas emissions, they will capture the benefits, the mitigation benefits associated with these programs. And that helps to kind of emphasize and underline why this is not a framework for the transfer of emission reductions. This is a framework for building mitigation capacity in implementing countries. It's not a framework for transferring units out of a host country for surrender against targets in another country, which of course was, as I said earlier, was the role of the CDM. So now, if we just come back to the roles of the participants, and the last set really are the project developers and what their responsibilities are. So it's their responsibility to work with the implementing government to help establish the coordinating body and make sure that this is a workable arrangement. They need to work with the issuance body, for example, the Verified Carbon Standard, to develop the appropriate ESG methodology, which measures the deliverable of interest. They need to develop feasibility studies to produce the ESG within the regulatory framework of the implementing country and determine the costs of producing the environmental and social goods in compliance with the country's requirements. And then, and we'll come to this in a bit more detail shortly, I would propose that they then bid for the right to sell these environmental and social goods to the donor nation or the fund, whoever the buyer is. And then if they're successful in that bidding process, to develop the project and deliver the environmental and social goods for the duration of the contract period, and then transfer or continue to operate the technology with ongoing appropriate MRV responsibilities, and that's to make sure that this long-term mitigation continues to be delivered. Now, I mentioned the bidding process, and if any of you have followed the World Bank's methane facility discussions, you'll be familiar with this, because we're proposing that, sort of the financing mechanism for this is through a put auction, where the donor auctions the right to sell the environmental goods at a strike price. So, for example, the donor may offer an ESG strike price, and in our case we take an example of $500,000 per megawatt hour of renewable energy capacity, and that needs to be commissioned in the implementing country on or before the 31st of December 2025. So the donor is saying, for every unit that you deliver through a verified process, I'll pay you $500,000 for every megawatt hour. And then the project developers or the investors in this space bid for the right to sell at that price. So you would bid in, and you might be successful winning that bid at, for example, $250,000, which means that that's the price you'd have to pay for the right to sell at $500,000. And when you deliver your ESG, you would then get $500,000 back, but net it would be $250,000. So that's how the mechanism works, and it's quite an interesting mechanism, because there's this put auction discourages entrants from simply bidding the price down, because this is often the problem when we hold auctions of this kind. People bid and the price gets pushed down and down and down until whoever eventually wins it isn't actually able to implement it because they've bid themselves too low, and then all kinds of horrible things happen, but at the end of the day, you don't get the mitigation capacity built, and that's really what we care about. So we need to make sure this mechanism works. Now, there's an interesting question here, and we had some debate about this in the World Bank methane facility, and that's that should the environmental social goods be exchangeable? So in other words, if you bid in and you say, well, I'm going to provide you, 50 of these units from this project, but it turns out that in the end you can buy them from somebody else more cheaply, can you exchange them, or should they be tied in? And this is an interesting point to discuss. And again, you might like to come back to that in the questions. And then the payment process. The buyer, so that's the donor, eventually takes delivery of the environmental and social goods, and that would then trigger a number of payments. First of all, X% directed to the project developer to support the returns on investment. And it's important that that payment is coming directly from the donor to the project developer. It's not coming through the implementing country. And this, of course, was a very strong feature of the CDM through this letter of approval and the transfer of allowances out of the country and so on, that meant that investors got the units into their account outside of the host country, and it reduced the risk. Well, this is borrowing from that very important lesson to make it clear that investors need to be paid directly from the donor. So X% of the money goes to the investor, Y% then goes to the implementing unit in the host ministry, and this is to provide them with or help them build the long-term support for development capacity to achieve the target, building the enabling environment. And as I said earlier, that's not particularly difficult for megawatts of renewable energy, but it could well be more relevant in other areas. And then one of the key points about this then is that all participants' interests are aligned, and basically what that means is everybody gets paid when the ESG gets delivered. So it is in the host countries or the implementing countries' interests, and it's in the investors and the project developers' interests to ensure that these units are delivered. And so you increase the chances of everybody working together to achieve the same goal, and that ultimately increases the chances of the mitigation being delivered. Now, there's a few sort of specific design criteria. The purchase terms, first of all, the developer, or a sensible developer, will only accept the technology risk because the environmental and social goods are only being developed for sale to one buyer. There is no potential upside. And when we look back at the CDM, of course, there was always the expectation that the price would go up. People would sell a proportion of their delivery and hold on to the rest, hoping that they'd be able to sell for $20 or $30 or whatever. Under this mechanism, there is no upside. You only have one buyer, and they have contracted to buy the ESG that you're producing. If they don't buy them, you're not going to be able to take them to the market to sell to anybody else. Therefore, all this sort of country risk, registration, issuance risk, and so on that we're familiar with, it must be minimised to ensure investors come into the space. The ESG purchase agreement should cover all units produced by the project, so it's quite different from an ERPA. And the price could be front-loaded to increase the returns to investors. And so what I mean there is that you could alter the prices that's paid, and that would be good for everybody, because in our example of the renewable energy capacity, if you can build it sooner and get it operational sooner, it has a bigger mitigation benefit than if you wait until 2025 and build it then. So you could front load these prices or these auctions to try to bring action sooner. The share of revenues to the implementing ministry must have a good chance of building the enabling environment, because otherwise we won't get this long-term mitigation. And provisions required to ensure that activities continue post-target date and go on to deliver long-term mitigation. These need to be built in. So it could be a form of handover in a build, operate and transfer project, or it could be an ongoing obligation for the original project developer, and so those features need to be built in. And this is my final slide. The advantages of this design. Well, we see this as a way to fast start a NAMA because actually there's probably still some of that sort of project development capacity out there. I think there are plenty of organisations still that would recognise this kind of a model, would see similarities to what they've been doing in the past. And could quite quickly get into action if they had the opportunity to bid to offer the sale of these ESGs. It's a mechanism for the Green Climate Fund or others to invest in mitigation through the private sector under implementing countries' terms. So I think that should appeal to a number of these sort of donor funds. I think that it offers good value to the implementing government. They get private sector investment into a selected sector under their terms because they get to specify what the deliverables are. And I think it's good value for the donor because they get tailored ESG at a market price. That means if they want to pay for cook stoves or if they want to pay for renewable energy capacity, they can specify what it is. They'll be very clear about what they want to see paid and the environmental and social benefits that are attached to that particular deliverable. And then finally, I think that this builds an enabling environment in parallel to real action. So as the implementing ministry receives support from the donor via the delivery of the ESG, so things go hand in hand. So I think I have 30 minutes to make my presentation. I think I'm just about on that time. Some of the questions I'd sort of posed in terms of discussion, in case you all don't have any other questions. What technologies might this be best suited to? Who would be potential buyers of the goods? Could the VCS, for example, provide the framework for hosting the activities? I think that they're already developing something very similar. I think that they're using different terminology, but I think there are some work going on. How would you minimize the risks for investors if there's no wider market for the environmental social goods? What sorts of guarantees would you want to see? And how could you ensure the mitigation activities continue post the target date? What sort of requirements would be suitable for different types of technologies? So that's the end of the presentation. So thank you much for your attention. And I think now we've got a number of some polling questions and then scope to ask questions. So I'll hand back to Alexandra. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Gareth, for the excellent presentation. I'm sure it will generate an interesting discussion today. Apologies also for the technical difficulties that we experienced, but we could solve them pretty quickly. And should you have any questions on the presentation or what you couldn't hear, so then this will be addressed during the Q&A session. But to start with the Q&A session, we have prepared 3 teaser questions. The first question is, how important do you think NAMAs will be in the development of an international climate action between now and 2020? Oh, so let's see. The poll is up for voting. Okay, so almost everyone thinks that it will be important or even very important over the next 6 years. So Gareth, maybe you could comment the answers of the audience.
Yes, yes, thank you. So as Alexander said, we've got 95% of people are saying important or very important, and I think that I think that clearly the challenge is with us. NAMAs have been around for quite some time, having been proposed back in as part of the Bali Action Plan, if I recall, and we've been a little bit slow to get things going. So in the development of these kinds of policy initiatives and so on, 6 years isn't very long. And I think you could certainly count off a year to get something like this sort of developed and then to talk about funding and so on. So I think that if we are going to have NAMAs playing an important role between now and 2020, then I really think that we need to think about how to get these things moving quickly. And so, mechanisms or proposals for how we might look at fast start NAMAs, I would suggest the audience is saying that those are very important considerations.
Okay, the second question is, how much potential do you think that the approach for the design of a fast start NAMA presented in today's webinar has for future use? Okay, so more than 70% think that it has some potential and only 6% think that it has no potential. So I think this is an interesting response. Gareth, what do you think?
Yes, good. I think that's very encouraging. So we have some potential, 75%, and about 20% feeling high potential. I think what would be very interesting would be to understand the background of the audience and whether we have public sector, private sector, what the split is. I know we're not going to have that information, but it would be interesting to know how different people see that. Certainly, from my background, coming as a project developer and somebody who's been involved in putting private sector money into CDM projects to date, then of course, that's why I've structured the proposal in the way, but I feel that it has a lot of interest for the deployment of private sector money. I think the potential to leverage is very interesting, and to achieve this sort of 4-to-1 ratio that they talk about in the Green Climate Fund. But with 75% of the group feeling it has some potential, clearly I'm more on the sort of the optimistic side. So I think it'd be interesting to know the background of more people on the call. But I understand, of course, we won't get that, but just posing that as a thought.
Okay, and the last question is, how likely is it that you will be involved in the design and implementation of a NAMA in the next 12 months? Okay, so more than 80%, almost 90% think that they will be involved in a way, likely or very likely, in the implementation of a NAMA, which is also very encouraging, I think.
Yes, I think that is very encouraging indeed, because we've got 90 people on the call, so that's almost one vote per person. So it means that we're looking at something like 60 people on this call who are likely or very likely to be involved in the development of NAMAs, which I think is very encouraging indeed, because clearly this is a concept that has a lot of potential. I suppose the other side of the coin is that this is in some ways a self-selecting audience, and people who are interested in NAMAs are more likely to be on the call than not, but nevertheless I think it's good to see that there is so much interest.
Thank you very much, Gareth. The forum is now open for your questions, and I have already received the first question. So Lorraine is asking how a local government or subnational government could participate in such a framework.
I don't see any particular difficulty in a subnational government if they have, or subnational entity participating, as long as they have the ability to set some sort of binding target that can be used as the deadline by which activities need to be implemented. And I think some sort of binding target is important. Otherwise, you don't have any focus. You don't have any sort of deadline against which to implement activity. But if that authority, for example, a municipality, if they have the authority to set some sort of local requirement or regulation that can be used as the basis for making these activities effectively additional, making them transformational, then the next stage is simply to find a donor who's willing to support you at that level. So I think that what we're proposing here, although I talked about implementing countries in the scope of things, that can equally be applied to subnational jurisdictions, with the caveat that they then need, I guess under the NAMA framework, they need to get a ministerial approval, which would have to happen at the national level.
Okay, thank you, Gareth. Eichberger is asking that the proposed design has many similarities with green investment schemes, and do you think that experiences drawn from such an
Alexander, I'm just losing you a little bit.
Okay, sorry. Do you think that experience drawn from the GIS, from the green investment scheme, can be used in the design of NAMAs in certain countries?
Well, I think that we've learned such a huge amount over the past 10 or 15 years through CDM and JI, and there's a lot to do moving forward, but there's a huge amount to build on. And the GIS, the green investment schemes, and so on, all contribute to this vast body of knowledge and experience that we have. Clearly, there are significant differences between GIS and the fact that some of these sorts of schemes were based around the use of assigned amount units and so on, which is a mechanism which isn't going to, I think, isn't going to exist in the future going forward. But the the experience that we have in raising finance for these kinds of activities, the experience that we built in monitoring and reporting on these activities is all extremely relevant. And, one of the biggest dangers that we have is that we lose that experience through the loss of expertise and people who were active in this market 10 years ago. And then we run the risk of having to learn everything all over again. So, if there is relevant experience that we learned 10 years ago, we need to try to make sure that we capture that and we don't require ourselves to relearn through a painful process of learning by doing again.
Okay, thank you. And Van Murillo is asking if there are any initiatives worldwide in mitigation of emissions from the marine sector.
Not an area that I know very much about. I mean, I know, of course, that sort of the IMO, the International Maritime Organization, like ICAO, were left out of the international negotiations. And ICAO now are making progress, but the IMO seems to be still further behind this. So, as far as I'm aware, there's relatively little progress in the maritime industry. More emphasis, I think, has been put on SOx and NOx emissions from their engines and the fact that they burn very dirty fuel with high sulfur contents. And I think they tend to focus more on optimizing their engines to reduce the SOx and NOx emissions and care less about the CO2 emissions. But there's a real danger that we leave this sector out of the negotiations. In that sense, if people have proposals or initiatives to come forward, then it'd be very good. The other challenge is, of course, it's an international issue, and so I think you would have difficulty covering that under a NAMA, which is a national mitigation action. And so then you'd be restricted to inland waters, which would be ferries and kind of small transport, which isn't really the main part of the international shipping emissions.
Okay, Uka Petra Rulo is asking that his impression is that the proposed approach only focuses on one or two indicators, for example, megawatt of renewable energy installed, and that only one indicator is not enough to ensure that the NAMA targets have been achieved. So how do you deal with this?
Well, I think this is again back to, first of all, I would say this is the host country, implementing country issue to decide what they feel is appropriate for their national mitigation, which is nationally appropriate mitigation actions. So if a country feels that installing renewable energy capacity or installing energy efficiency units is appropriate to their mitigation, then, that's their prerogative to say so. And they would enter into negotiations with a donor country to agree. And maybe they wouldn't find a donor country who's willing just to pay for megawatts of renewable energy. Maybe they want to qualify that further and say, well, we want megawatts of renewable energy using this type of technology in these regions of the country, with connection to connecting up rural areas that don't otherwise have it. So they get to specify what it is they want to deliver. Bearing in mind that the more complicated you make it, then the greater the transaction costs, the greater the risks for project developers, the harder it is to get involved and to ensure you can deliver this mitigation action. So whilst I understand, I think, where the question is coming from, as an investor and as somebody who wants to see mitigation capacity constructed and put in place, then, I would want to see workable and achievable deliverables being requested. And I would rely on the fact that there is, you select deliverables or environmental and social goods that are correlated to national mitigation. And for me, it's then, does the donor accept that correlation? Is it strong enough? And is the implementing country, are they happy with the environmental and social good that's being delivered?
Okay, thank you, Gareth. Alvin Leo is asking, the put option is an interesting idea, but does it really remove all risk of overbidding? Developers could bid too close to the strike price and not be able to complete the project. I worry about project completion risk. Who takes or shares that risk?
Yes, there's nothing, I don't think there is a mechanism that can stop people bidding for a price in the end that they can't afford. And we had this discussion again. I think this took place within the World Bank methane facility. The fact that bidders have to put some, as we say, sort of skin in the game. If you bid $250,000 for the right to sell at $500,000, then that's money that you've got to be able to put on the table, and it's possible to undertake a due diligence process to make sure that that money is available. That in itself starts to screen out developers who aren't able to, who aren't big enough or sufficiently well capitalized to deliver on the units. It reduces the risks for the for the donors and the implementing country that these units aren't going to be delivered. Now, but I hasten to say, that's an example for a renewable energy capacity, which is a large infrastructure development play. It would be quite different if you were looking at the distribution of water purifiers or cook stoves and things like that. And and there could well be other sources of finance that could help developers to come up with the stake that they need to post in advance. But I think the bid option is at least one step closer to being able to ensure that these units are delivered and the price doesn't get bid down. And this then also has some relation to whether or not these units are exchangeable, and whether, if you can't build them for the price that you've bid, can you buy them from somebody else who can build them? And so that's a quite important consideration that you might want to sort of put into this structure of the bidding process.
Okay, thank you, guys. Nare Lee is asking if a project developed by a multi-development bank and already financed through donors' money can be part of such a framework, and then what role can a multi-development bank have, and can we participate through project developers?
Yeah, Alexandra, can you just read the first part of that question again, please?
A project that has been developed by a multi-development bank and is already financed through donor money. Can this be part of such a framework?
I'm not sure if it's already being financed, then you kind of be retrofitting this process into it, which, there would be no, you could do that. Effectively, you might just as well say, we want to kind of monitor the progress of this project through a payment by results process. So I think it wouldn't necessarily then result in a fast start NAMA if it's already being implemented. The second part, I think, was whether you could implement this through project developers, and I think, again, going back to my experience as working for a project developer, I think that this would be an attractive approach, because if we can find a source of funding, 25% would be great. If you could get 25% equity into your business model to start with, then raising the remaining 75%, which is then paid back through the sale of electricity revenues or whatever. This wouldn't necessarily be difficult. So I think project developers would find such a model quite attractive.
Okay, thank you. And Gautam Hindal is asking, as he's saying that the idea seems to be good, but for major technologies, but what about mitigation technologies that are relatively new, like new irrigation techniques? This might not be attract bidding from private sector. Are there other useful methods for leveraging private sector finance?
Well, I think the answer to that is that it depends on the strike price that is that's bid in. I off the top of my head, I don't know what the deliverable would be if we were looking at irrigation techniques, or but if it's a new technology, if it's higher risk, then bidders are going to bid a lower price for the right to sell at a strike price. And so, that would be picked up in that's the job of the project developers, to work out what price they can deliver this technology for and then bid on that basis.
Okay, thank you. Sasha Eichberger is asking, the proposed approach foresees strong involvement of implementing country governments and requires high level of capacity. Do you think that some LDCs would be left out due to lack of capacity? Should multi-development banks take some of these implementing country tasks in such countries?
Yes, I think you're right. I mean, I think that's a very good point. And the fact is, you do need stronger infrastructure to implement these kinds of measures. The answer to that question, which is my personal view, is that actually the project-based activities, the CDM, remains an extremely good and appropriate model for implementing activities in countries that lack institutional infrastructure. So I would see that a NAMA framework or a NAMA activity is something that is probably more suitable to countries that have the capacity to implement or to develop stronger institutional infrastructure. And there may well be opportunities. Maybe there's sectors, for example, the energy sector in LDCs, where there is greater infrastructure where they could implement a NAMA, but other kinds of activities may be better suited to using project-based activities where the only infrastructure required is the host country approval process, and the rest is done by the project developers and the DOEs.
Okay, thank you. Philip Hauser is asking, it was said that NAMAs will not help the CDM, but I would strongly argue that CDM is key to help NAMAs and to assure sound MRV and international sustainability. I feel free from tons of CO2.
Alexandra, I'm just missing you again. You're getting away from the microphone, I think.
So did you hear the beginning of the question?
I heard the start, yes.
Okay, but I feel free from tons of CO2 as a measure and establish sustainable development goals. This is leading to economically rational greenhouse gas mitigation. In addition, there seems to be in addition of intelligent donors.
I'm just reading the question on the screen.
Okay.
Philip, thank you for the question. And I know we've discussed this. Philip is an active member of the Project Developer Forum, so I'm very pleased that he's on the call. Yes, I mean, I've tried to make the point at the outset of the presentation that this is a different mechanism and it's not necessarily a lifeline for the CDM. I agree that NAMAs learn a huge amount, they take a huge amount, and definitely the MRV experience that we have from the CDM is extremely relevant. But at the same time, I made the point that NAMAs are not designed for the transfer of emission reduction units or accounting units from one country to another. I believe that, as the name suggests, that they are for creating mitigation in the host country, and therefore we don't necessarily need to burden the structure and the operation of NAMAs with the same level of MRV activities as we see in the CDM. Now, the mechanism that I've proposed is predominantly for donor, and I said it's a broad definition of donors. Those are the ones that I would see putting in the public sector money, but it's the private sector who then bid for the right to sell those activities and are the recipients of this donor funding, and who are then able to reach out and raise additional finance from private sector sources to provide the leverage. So whilst the additional funding or the initial funding is coming from donor sources, the largest part through the leverage process is private sector input. And I think that this kind of structure is particularly relevant to the kinds of sounds that we hear coming out of the Green Climate Fund, who are looking to leverage funding, who want to involve the private sector, and who aren't necessarily interested in taking delivery of emission reduction units. So, and then will it bring large capital volumes needed for transformational investments? I mean, if this were taken up enthusiastically and there were many NAMAs structured where the private sector could bid in to sell environmental and social goods to donors, then I think it could trigger quite significant capital volumes. But NAMAs are only one element of a sort of a much larger policy environment, and they're not going to solve everything, but they may help in a number of ways.
Okay, thank you. So I take one last question from George Ramos. He's asking, how do you see opportunities for forest conservation and deforestation reduction under a NAMA model?
Well, thank you very much for that question. That's very interesting because I think, forestry is an area that, I trained originally as a forester, and my early work in carbon was in forestry, and I've since sort of moved out of that space somewhat because I've really kind of given up on the role of the private sector in RED activities and so on. But what I do see, and I gave the example as one of the areas, was that one of the environmental and social goods that you could use as a deliverable would be hectares of forest under sustainable forest management. So, and this is only as kind of a first idea, but for example, you could say, a donor government could say, well, I'm willing to pay up to $100 per hectare of forest that is put under sustainable forest management, certified against Forest Stewardship Council principles and criteria. For example, now that would create a mechanism that would help bring forest under sustainable forest management, which would help to address deforestation and so on. It would be a clear deliverable in terms of the hectares that are there. It's got private sector involvement, it's independently verified, and so on. It is correlated to mitigation activities, because if you're managing the forest sustainably, then you're not deforesting, you're not, in theory, you're not reducing over the long term, you're not reducing the carbon stock. So I would say that it would be interesting to explore that further as a way of including forestry under some sort of NAMA activity, but not necessarily within the existing RED frameworks that are being put in place.
Okay, before we close, I would like to hand over one last time to Gareth to give him also the opportunity to say goodbye.
Thank you very much indeed, everybody. It's been, I've certainly enjoyed myself preparing and delivering this presentation. I hope you found it interesting. Thanks also to UNDP for inviting me and for your constructive inputs in the preparation, and also to my colleagues in the PD Forum who helped me prepare this.
So as the clock ticks by, I would like to thank again Gareth, of course, for his very interesting presentation, and Peter and his team for the good collaboration, the WBIE technical team for making this webinar possible, and especially you, our audience, for joining in and making the session interactive. The presentation and the recording will be available within the next 24 hours on the WE Institute website. We would also very much appreciate your feedback on this session, so please take a minute after this session to provide your feedback. And I would also like to announce our upcoming 5th webinar, which will be held in June, when we will present a case study of a NAMA that built its carbon metrics on a standardized baseline. We hope to meet you all again in June. So until next time, thank you very much and wish you a very good day.